Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who obviously has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Now in this video, let's talk about mythology. So first thing to note is that I believe that the mythology is tightly connected to language itself, right? And it's kind of understandable because mythology is basically a bunch of fairy tales, if you think about it, and you cannot tell any tale if you don't have language to do that. So perhaps I would say that mythology appears roughly at the same time as language does, although obviously I cannot prove that, nor can I, disprove that, but I think this is the case. So basically, mark, no mythology before language. And if you think about it, like the most basic idea, like the most basic scheme of mythological plot, let's say, is that somebody existed and they did something, right? So this is like the template for any type of mythological story. And here I should note an important thing, which would be like a running thread of this whole video, is that this somebody who existed, it's only a posteriori implication. So what we really observe is the action, right? The result, the consequence of this action that they did. But we only imply the existence of the subject that did this action, like a posteriori, like after we've observed what we've observed, whatever that was. So and you can observe that the same pattern in language also. Like, let's say you have a noun, a plowman, right? So the noun plowman appears only as like the consequence of an action of plowing. So a plowman is someone who plows, but not vice versa. It's not like plowing is something that plowman does. No, it doesn't work that way. So in some sense, verbs are the primary thing in language, right? And nouns are only secondary. Even though kind of technically we think in reverse. We kind of tend to absolutize in some sense nouns because they're kind of like the source of action. But as cognition works, it's exactly reversed. We see some action, we see some verb, so to speak, and we imply the noun as its source. So this is kind of the basic pattern of thinking that is very characteristic of all mythology and of all of our cognition, essentially. So we can say that, like the basic figure of consciousness and cognition is this implication of a source through the observation of consequences, of actions, right? Of some natural phenomena or whatever, social phenomena. So let's examine some, typical examples that are given in philosophy. Like philosophers, for example, very much fond of thinking about tables, because apparently they don't have a really pronounced social life, so they sit at home and stare at their tables. So they like the example of a table a lot, and then they philosophize over it, or maybe under it, if you know what I mean. It's a typical example of how an object is constructed. So we perceive the table, like we can see it, we can hear it, like if we knock on it, right? We can smell it, we can lick it and taste it and whatever, we can touch it to feel the texture or whatever. So we have this sum of our possible perceptions, and we kind of imply that there is a single source of all this sum of perceptions, right? So we insert the table into the picture. We're saying that the table is the reason that we feel all that, right? So in this way, we can say that the very concept of object, like a table, is only a way of organizing our perceptions, our experience, all these senses that we have, kind of because of the existence of this object. Whereas, in fact, what happens is exactly reversed. We have perceptions, and we kind of insert artificially the table as the reason for these impressions that we have. So, and again, I think this is a central kind of a running theme in the way mythology appears. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, okay, kind of returning to this plowman example, I would like to say that we kind of insert a plowman because we observe that plowing is happening, you know. It kind of sounds stupid because we can actually see the plowman. So again, we have all these perceptions of the source itself, but still, I hope you can see the pattern. That's what I'm saying. And an interesting example of all that might be represented by, you know, these magic tricks, like illusionists, because illusionists basically, they kind of play with that basic cognitive pattern, you know. They try to make an impression of an object that doesn't exist, for example, so that you would think that it should exist. Or vice versa, they create an impression, or rather like they kind of tend to hide the object that do exist by, you know, some again tricks. So it's really funny to observe like how our cognition works in these, you know, query areas. Yeah, so this is basically what illusionism and magic is all about. It's a way to trick your cognition by, you know, utilizing some of the most basic properties of it, and make some money in the process, obviously. And it's not only magic, you know. If you think like it really might be observed all over the culture. Like if you think about movies, let's say, when you're watching a movie, you perceive a bunch of objects, a bunch of people that do something, blah blah blah, but they're not really there, right? What you're seeing really is just a bunch of pixels on a screen that just change their color and their brightness. Yeah, not even their color, just the brightness. And still you can see the objects that are not even there, you know. So it kind of demonstrates this basic idea of how cognition works, that you insert the object because you have certain experiences, certain, you know, perceptions. Yeah, and I believe that this is the key pattern for the emergence of the whole mythology and the whole culture, if you think about it. Like take just art as a general example. Like what art really is, what any piece of art is basically, you know, like a teleport beacon. Like an artist has certain impression. He has or she has certain, you know, emotional response to something, some, you know, whatever, and they try to express that by creating a piece of art, an object, which would, in the best case scenario, allow a listener or viewer or whatever to experience the same type of impression that the artist had when they were creating this piece of art, right? So it's like a shortcut, you know, like a teleport beacon. That's the best analogy that I can have here. Like when you're watching on a painting, looking on a painting, what you see is just a bunch of paint on a canvas, like literally. But you still can see objects there, like, I don't know, if it's a landscape, you can see rivers, trees, whatever, and not only that, not only do you see these objects, but you also might feel the impressions that the artist had when they were, you know, painting it, right? So again, yeah, this is like a and it has the very same basis as our language, as our mythology, as I've said. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting thing to think about. Or you're listening to a piece of music and you have this more or less, I mean, if the music is good, you have more or less the same type of emotional reaction to it as the artist had when he was composing, or she was composing, this piece of music. I mean, again, in the best case scenario. Of course, you can, I mean, insert your own meanings to that music if it is associated with some period of your life, let's say. But that's like a secondary layer of interpretation, right? And again, like the same story is characteristic of life itself, like how we perceive the world. We do it on the very same basis. Like, I would even say that, you know, in certain sense, objects don't even exist. Like, we only imply their existence, we only insert them in the world, just as a way of organizing our experiences, right? Just as a shortcut, some sort of, you know, condensed version of the world, just to orient more quickly, right? Just to organize our perceptions in a quick manner. So we say, well, there's a table, and everyone kind of knows already what that means. They know all these perceptions they might get from that table, right? That I've described described previously. So, and you might think of some other interesting examples of that pattern of thinking, like, for example, the so-called object-oriented programming, right? That is pretty popular, although it's kind of dwindling already, but still, it's a very effective way of organizing the programming code, right? So you can create these objects and relations between them, whereas in fact they're not there in some sense, right? They're just some imaginary stuff. But it has proven to be a very effective way of organizing the code, because otherwise the code would be just, you know, pretty chaotic. Like, it would be really hard to orient yourself in it. And I think that it is a good analogy of how objects are created in our real world, in some sense, by people when they perceive the world. And perhaps this is related in some way to the way our brain works. I'm not sure about that, but that sounds like a reasonable hypothesis. Like, you probably know that the brain has, like, for example, one of the techniques of how to quickly memorize stuff is to associate some memories with some places, right? So you can just imagine that you're just walking somewhere. You know, this method of loci, L-O-C-I, where you just literally almost like imagine you're walking in some library where you have, you know, some segments of your memory marked, like, whatever. You know, this Sherlock's, BBC Sherlock's, who popularized this idea of mind palace. It's a very effective technique of organizing your memory, and I believe that it should be related to the way our brain works. Like, perhaps for a brain, it's much easier to associate memories, associate perceptions with some, you know, stable networks of neurons, perhaps. So that, you know, when you have one memory, you have immediately association of multiple other memories with it. So you can, again, kind of condense, kind of archive all these memories and perceptions in an effective manner in this way. And I believe that the same perceptive scheme is characteristic of mythology itself. So if you think about, like, the basic pattern of thinking of mythological consciousness, you would arrive at something like, well, first we perceive that something happens, then we kind of interpret it in the most familiar way, again, kind of these, you know, neuron networks kind of firing that say, hey, I've seen that before, something similar, right? And then the last step is to construct the actor, invoke some source of these perceptions, right? And I can again give you an example of this proverbial table of philosophers. So if a mythological consciousness that have never seen a table before perceives the table, they might say, well, okay, it has 4 legs, therefore it kind of looks like a horse, right? It's this interpretive stage, so to speak. But it's still different than from a horse, you know. First of all, it doesn't move. Secondly, it's kind of hard. It has different texture, etc., etc. So they observe these differences, and the last kind of stage is them invoking some story as how a horse might have turned into this table, for example. Like they might say, well, just off the top of my head, like, okay, there was a horse that kind of angered the gods, and they've turned it into a table, let's say. This is like, of course, it's kind of far-fetched, but I just hope to illustrate this pattern of mythological thinking to you through this very stupid and silly example. Okay, so to kind of sum up the things I've been talking about before, I think you can say that mythology is really like this mythological thinking of invocation of the source of action, of object or a subject, if you like, that produced some action that we perceive, is really the basis of all the culture. And again, it kind of looks like it emerges immediately with the language itself, right? You only need language to tell stories, basically. And afterwards, more complicated patterns of thinking appear, patterns of cognition, such as, you know, religion, art, and much later science, and things like that. But fundamentally, they have the same root, the same mythological root, the same linguistic root, if you like. So I would say that, yeah, mythology is definitely a genuine cultural basis, yeah, again, it kind of emerges at the same time as language does. And in a way, I think you can say that language is like a medium where, like you know, how mathematicians perceive space, I mean, in mathematical sense, as the medium where vectors live, right? Space is just room for vectors to exist in. And in the same way, we can say that language is just a space for stories to exist in, for mythological stories fundamentally to exist in. And you can observe the very same pattern even in like the most profound scientific works. Like let's take lightning as example. Like a mythological consciousness might say, well, it's the Zeus who throws lightning, right? So they invoke Zeus as a source of the observed phenomenon of lightning, whereas modern science would say, well, no, it's the cosmic rays that ionize the atmosphere, which, you know, since we have a potential difference in it, we have ions and electrons moving there and discharging, you know, the streamers appear and the atmosphere breaks down, etc., etc. But this is, if you think about it really hard, like it's really the same mythological story. Like you invoke all these actors, you know, all these electrons, ions, cosmic rays, potential difference in the atmosphere. Those are pretty complicated concepts on their own, but they're still related pretty much to this basic pattern of mythological thinking, in my opinion. So there's a really interesting example that Nietzsche gives. It's not really related to the topic, but it's just too good to miss. So I want to bring it up. So I think it's so in one of his books, Nietzsche kind of gives an idea that perhaps for a prehistoric man, you know, the act of rowing, you know, in a boat, in a river or something, is not even a sort of a mechanistic act of like literally rowing, you know, like pushing against the water, but rather it's almost like a ritual of invocation of like river gods so that they would move your boat, right? It's just kind of, I would like you to appreciate like how many interpretations the very same act might have, right? So you might have many mythologies on the same source material, if you like. You might have a mythology of Newtonian mechanics that you know, moves the boat as you kind of push against the water with your how do you even call it? I don't know the proper name. Sorry. But anyway, so here I didn't even I wasn't really talking about where does that emerge from, right? The mythology itself. I was only discussing the very patterns, the very pattern of thinking that is characteristic of mythology. But I just want to mention the, you know, something I've already mentioned in one of my previous videos, the electric universe paradigm, which thinks that mythology, the very appearance of mythology, might be related to some astronomical phenomena, you know, like for example, if sometime in the past the planets, I mean planets like Venus, Mars, Saturn, if they were closer to the Earth and people could have observed them directly, like being very huge in the sky, and they've kind of tried to anthropomorphize them, you know, like Mars was a warrior, Venus was a goddess, queen, mother, whatever, etc., etc. So they've invoked all this mythology to explain what they were observing. And by the way, okay, that might be, but I've had this idea of my own that, you know, like in religion, in all these religious depictions, you know, oftentimes you have, you know, saints and gods with these nimbuses over their heads. So I've had once this idea that maybe this nimbus is actually the planet. You know, it's kind of circular, but the person that is kind of drawn below it, it's just an attempt to really anthropomorphize what was observed. So what was observed really was this sphere, the circle, but the person is kind of a later addition to that to interpret what was happening in the sky, right? But okay, that might be too hardcore. But anyway, so there's an idea that the astronomical phenomena might have caused the emergence of mythology, like for example, a very strong polar lights, you know, aurora, like if it was like several orders of magnitude stronger than the one we observe today, it might have created all these patterns in the sky, and people tried to interpret it in some more or less understandable manner, I mean, to them, and they've invoked all these gods, etc., etc., and perhaps language appeared right at that same time. I mean, language to be able to tell all these stories that were observed. And later on, it created religion and art, when, you know, people have drawn petroglyphs of these plasma phenomena. But anyway, so if you're interested in that, please read people like Anthony Peratt, Dave Talbot, Eduardo Cardona, John Cook. There are many interesting thinkers in that area. But okay, I think I've kind of ranted enough for today. I was just so embarrassed by my previous video with you know, I was just kind of repeating myself over and over, and it's so stupid. I mean, if you're pissed off by it, so am I, pretty much. So I wanted to make a follow-up video as soon as possible to kind of erase that impression. Yeah, so there you go. There is this video is the one I want to use to that end. Okay, so yeah, I'll probably make another video soon about the knowledge, you know, as a set of stories. But anyway, to conclude this video, I want to say that I think that mythology really reveals these most basic patterns of our thinking, and in particular, you know, this invocation of a subject, of an actor, from the observation of actions. And it really relates really tightly to more complicated forms of culture, such as religion, art, science, etc. And I hope I've been able to show it to you on these really simple examples that I've drawn. So, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.